My friends, truth is our beloved Ukrainska Armia is running out of soldiers, especially trained soldiers. And this problematic will further deepen the challenges for Ukraine regarding its counteroffensive plans for spring or summer 2023. Now, I'm aware that this might be a sensitive topic. Here from German newspaper Die Welt. Kiev urgently needs more soldiers. In the West, we keep talking about helping Ukraine with military equipment. But the fact is, a lot of Ukrainian brigades are actually the size of regiments. That's a 60% drop in intended manpower. Ukraine needs troops so badly. It is said that Ukraine wants to draft 1,000 police officers from every region of Ukraine and expects to field roughly 20,000 of them for combat operations. Here, The Economist admits Ukraine has visibly stepped up its mobilization activities in the first 2 months of 2023. In Ukraine, these days you can get drafted anywhere. Funerals, shopping centers, even ski resorts. There are many videos of draft agents apparently walking up to any eligible male to hand summons to join the armed forces of Ukraine. Here we can see 6 guys with their hands against a van, getting their papers checked by draft officers. Receiving a summons in Ukraine means one of 2 things. Number 1, obligation to present yourself at a recruitment office in order to register your details into the database. Or number 2, you may be required to pack your things and report to an army base to start training as a mobilized soldier. Like in this video where you see guys getting into a van with their duffel bags and personal belongings. So you'll see these black vans a bit everywhere, but don't expect any Mia Malkova inside, because the banging will be from Russian artillery at the front. If you don't respond to the call, they'll find you, and if you resist, you'll get in trouble. Like this one draft dodger that is forcibly dragged into a car. Meanwhile, this guy says, the best way to deter draft agents from walking up to you is to get a big angry dog to scare them off. But hold on! Let's get the facts straight. Ukraine claims to have lost 17,000 KIA. But somehow they need to mobilize every able-bodied man from the streets.
You don't find that suspicious?
And before some of you say, no, this is false, there's no mass mobilization. According to the BBC, Danilov, Ukraine's Secretary of National Security and Defense, said that in recent weeks summons have been distributed en masse in Ukraine. The word mass is very important. But then there's a backtrack. Danilov insists that the distribution of summons makes it possible to register conscripts and form a reserve. Welcome to History Legends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If you're new to the channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, just like with many other commentators, some of my Ukraine videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to all of you that have already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. The media loved to talk about Russian mobilization, but the topic of Ukrainian mobilization has gone a bit under the radar. Check out this article from October 4th by the European Council on Foreign Relations. They claim Ukraine to continue its successful counteroffensive. It may be necessary for Ukraine to draft more Ukrainian citizens. And that was before the Bakhmut Мясорубка, the meat grinder operation, which swallowed perhaps as many as 120,000 Ukrainian soldiers, KIA, wounded or POW. German newspaper Die Welt continues. For a long time, Ukraine was able to do without large-scale forced mobilizations. So great was the rush of volunteers. That has now changed because the losses at the front are dramatic. A lot of Ukraine's best, like these fighters from the elite Da Vinci Wolves, have been fighting since 2014, and here they are suffering high losses while holding the line in Bakhmut. Same story for the 127th Territorial Defense Brigade that has been fighting in Bakhmut for I don't know how many weeks now. A soldier from the 127th Brigade was deployed to Bakhmut with his group of around 45 men. After 11 days, 4 had been KIA and about 30 injured. Only a dozen were still fit to fight. Little pause, notice the ratio of 7.5 wounded for every KIA. This is good news because that means that Ukraine soldiers have been provided with better protective gear. and Ukrainian medics managed to save many more lives. However, that means they need a lot of replacements. Imagine rotating out an entire platoon every month and a half. Such high losses led these men from the 228th Battalion of the 127th Brigade to speak up about their conditions.
Обращаемся к народу Украины. Поддержите нас, потому что наших побратимов легло очень много раненых. Наше командование кидает на мясо.
У документах нас числиться там необмежена кількість по 100 людей, а фактично нас 20-30 чоловік в ротах. Цей момент нехай теж вирішується. Так, на даний час вже є, на 31 березня вже є люди, вже є наслідки цих злочинних наказів.
Now, truth be told, battle attrition is not the only reason behind this mobilization. The same article from the European Council on Foreign Relations also revealed the following. The Ukraine armed forces therefore need to prepare for a large influx of Russian troops arriving in Ukraine over the next few months. Their prediction was correct. Let's add up all the numbers. 200,000 Russians invaded Ukraine in February 2022. By fall, the Russian army called up at least 300,000 reservists, recruited up to 50,000 Wagnerians, and perhaps enlisted another 50 to 100,000 volunteers. This allowed the Russian army to plug the gaps, but not enough to launch large-scale offensives. So now, according to British intelligence reports, the Russian Federation is preparing to start recruiting an additional 400,000 troops through some sort of voluntary mobilization. Now, whatever mockery the media can come up with regarding these Russian mobilized military personnel, the fact is these Mobiks have managed to stand their ground in combat and effectively halted the Ukrainian offensive. Anyway, for me to get NAFOBot upvotes on Reddit, all this is corroborated by no other than the Washington Post. As spring offensive nears, Ukraine is drafting reinforcements. Notice how they avoid the word conscripts. Of course, after all the mockery they push towards Russian conscripts. The Ukraine army has long relied on volunteers, but now many Ukrainian men, even those working as volunteers or doing other useful jobs as civilians, cannot escape the draft. Now, what's strange is how this article also wrote the following. Ukraine has drafted around 1 million people to fight. 1 million! Yet they still need to draft men from the street. Where have they all gone? Essentially, since day one, Ukraine relied on volunteers, on patriotic fervor to swell the ranks of its armed forces. Recruitment offices were so overwhelmed that they first prioritized Ukraine's big pool of reservists, many of whom had fought in the Donbass in 2014 and 2015. But long gone are the days of big lineups of volunteers ready to enlist in the Ukrainian army. I suppose everyone now knows what is happening at the front, in Bakhmut, where entire battalions of mobilized personnel just disappear into the furnace. The article continues with the story of Alexei Khrushchevov, a 46-year-old washing machine repairman. He got into a fight in the street and the police came to break it up. When they checked his papers, they noticed he did not have any valid military exemption, and he's now pictured waiting in line outside a recruitment office in Kiev. He said he expects to be sent to training immediately and then to the front. But mobilized personnel are only for the reserve. Here's another, Alexander Kostyuk, a 52-year-old road repairman. He recently received his notice via the Human Resources Department at work. Here's Sasha, 35. He also thinks he will be drafted anytime. He said his worst fear is that even after attending basic training, he will not feel ready to fight. And then, listen up, and then the article writes, I quote, "That concern is not unfounded." From the Washington Post. Essentially, the article reveals that most conscripts don't know how to dig or reload their assault rifles properly before being sent to the front. As you can imagine, this will naturally lead to higher casualties. And this is exactly what this battalion commander named Kupal complained about. He said that his 500-man battalion suffered a 100% casualty rate, and that the new replacements are of very low quality compared to the well-trained veterans Ukraine had at the beginning of the war. And for speaking up about this issue to find a solution, he got demoted. Even worse, the mobilization campaign doesn't go as planned because the Wall Street Journal claims the following. A year into war, Ukraine faces challenges mobilizing troops. Long story short, a lot of people bribe government officials in order not to get these draft summons. I know, I'm shocked too, very surprising for Ukraine. Now in turn, this created a black market economy and lots of scams. Some guy paid $3,000 for documents listing him as unfit for service. The contact took his money and stopped answering his calls. Because technically every man aged 18 to 60 can be drafted. But there are draft exemptions for students, people with disabilities, and fathers with 3 or more children under the age of 18. In reality, it's a mess. This 38-year-old welder received 5 summons despite being the father of 3 children. For example, this father of 5 kids was less lucky as he was sent to the front with only 5 days of training. And the article reluctantly admits that tens of thousands of young Ukrainian males have fled abroad with dubious student certificates. Of course, it's easier to fake some sort of fake student document than to pump out 3 kids. Although, not for the Ukrainian chads out there. Which brings us back to the van. And then, one of the funniest stories in this article. There was this guy who bribed his way out of Ukraine and out of the draft. And then blames Ukraine for its corruption problems. Now there's a theory running on Telegram that Ukraine is mainly drafting men from Russian-speaking regions. But for example, these Wagnerians are holding IDs of fallen Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut. They say permanent residents Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, Kharkiv, Zaporozhye regions. From this we conclude that the pseudo-power sends mainly the Russian-speaking Orthodox population to slaughter. And this theory was supported by this post. Of course, always take it with a pinch of salt, but here I present it to you. In 2023, the majority of mobilized Ukrainian soldiers came from Odessa, Kharkiv, Mykolaiivka, and Poltava, essentially the south and east of the country, namely the Russian-speaking regions. And very little mobilized personnel were drafted in Ivano-Frankivsk or Lviv, which are predominantly Ukrainian. And check out what this Russian-speaking Ukrainian soldier had to say.
Как отличить хорошего украинца от плохого? Плохие украинцы, я, кстати, отношусь к одному из них, находятся сейчас на фронтовой линии, постоянно в каком-нибудь говне, в грязи, или же в данном случае в снегу. Вот. И самая главная отличительная черта плохого украинца, он разговаривает на русском. Хорошие же украинцы находятся в десятках или в сотнях километрах от линии фронта, вот, где-нибудь в тепле, в каких-нибудь условиях квартирных, вот, и разговаривают на украинском языке, як справжні патріоти.
To be honest, even if there's some truth to it, a lot of it has been exaggerated. However, the most important is that although they speak Russian, they fight for Ukraine. And to my knowledge, there was never a discussion for them to prefer fighting for Russia. In this article, Kelly Kilhofer, a retired colonel of the US Army Reserve, he went there to train Ukrainian troops and said he was very happy when he was able to train a group of soldiers for at least 3 to 4 weeks. But far more often, he says he got only 3 to 5 days. 3 to 5 days. This is what it takes me to get over jet lag. Kilhofer recalls, I'm like, look, if we had more time, these guys would last longer. I totally get it, it's also one of my greatest concerns. Kilhofer was understandably unhappy with the training Ukrainian soldiers got. Then he said that one Ukrainian officer insisted the conscripts actually learned a lot during their 3 days of training and would learn more at the front. Kilhofer replied, well, yeah, but you're talking to the alive ones. You're not talking to the dead ones. Ouch! It seems that because of the attrition rate, Ukrainians constantly need replacements to fill the gaps. So in turn, perhaps the Ukrainian army only bothers providing extra training to the troops that survived the first 2 months. Finally, Kilhofer speaks about one of the soldiers he trained. He was extremely proud of him, a former graphic artist named Ed. He remembered Ed to be funny, always smiling, and devoted to training and improvement. He could load magazines with ease and would constantly practice shooting. And then Ed, his total duration of military service was less than 2 weeks from conscription to death. Yeah, Ed was KIA on his first mission, an assault on a Russian trench line that went wrong. They got into a minefield and Ed left behind a wife and his toddler son. What's the point of putting so much effort into training these men for 3 days? There's no point. Now, in order to avoid being assigned to these, forgive me for the term, cannon fodder battalions of mobilized personnel, Ukrainian men have 2 options. Option 1. Volunteer into the armed forces. Now Ukrainians can sign up into one of Ukraine's new offensive guard brigades, which I mentioned in the previous video. Make sure to check it out. These offensive guard brigades only take in volunteers and not any draftees. For example, since early February 2023, 5,000 people have applied to join the Azov brigade. There, the training is a bit better. Yet the article still says that the training condenses the roughly 3-month US Marine Corps basic training into just 4 weeks. It's possible, likely even, that they could then be deployed almost immediately to the country's hottest front lines. According to this picture, we can see that most of these recruits are very young, late teenagers or guys in their early 20s. It's also important to mention that a lot of these motivated Ukrainians that volunteered were sent abroad for their military training courses. Thousands went through basic training with NATO instructors. And here you can see British soldiers saluting the Ukrainians that completed their course and that are now going back to the front. Now a lot of these volunteers are mixed up with combat veterans to form special brigades that receive extra training at the rear and that are mainly equipped with Western vehicles. We can expect these elite stormtrooper units to perform extremely well in combat, like this assault squad of the 71st Yega Brigade that captured and cleared this Russian position. Option 2. Private military training. Here's Dennis, 32, previously working in advertising. He's now training in case he ends up being drafted. They're all attending private military training in Kyiv. He said, I'm 100% sure I'll be drafted sooner or later. Their trainer is an active duty serviceman, and his goal is to prepare these civilian men who work in IT, advertising, and various desk jobs on how to fight and, in this case, on how to complete some room clearing operations. To conclude, building an army is more than just providing good equipment and proper individual training to soldiers. You can be the best soldier in the best squad with the best squad leader. If your battalion commander is an idiot, you might be sent into a minefield by mistake. Then you're all gone. But a good army, a winning army, requires a top-level corps of NCOs and officers at every level that will lead these men into battle. We're also talking about coordination between companies, battalions, brigades. All this takes time. It's not a question of weeks, but months, sometimes years. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to the channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.